Welcome to this video for elements of mission and evangelism that will help us for session 5 of the course, where we're going to think about missional ecclesiology, which is a fancy way of talking about how the nature of the church itself is missional and a focus on the local church. First of all, to sort of get our heads around this, we have to appreciate that it's quite a new idea that the local church is the centre of mission. For some centuries, mission was left to specialists and to particular organisations. For example, in the 19th century, there were many societies that were created in order to engage in mission. And for instance, there were 90 societies just working in China alone. So that sort of missionary era was all about giving the task of mission to specialists and special organisations, which the church funded. It sort of was they were donor organisations, so paying for those things, but mission was done by the specialists and the particular organisations rather than by local churches. But in the 20th century, the role of the local church was recovered, if you like. It was a sort of realisation that no, mission is not something to be done simply by experts over there, but mission is to be done by everyone wherever the church is. The church itself becomes missional again. And this is partly because in the West, for instance, the Western churches were confronted with their own decline and had to rethink. We can't leave mission to people far away. We need to think about mission on our own doorstep. And there was the question of church decline and church growth. So I'm going to think about two particular movements in that context. One is the church growth movement itself. This is a movement which very much focuses on the idea of the local church being missional. It was a movement designed to face the reality that Western churches were in decline and had been since the early 1900s. And so they were looking at churches that were managing to grow and say, how is it that some churches grow while most decline? And so this sort of research was being done in the 1950s and 60s in particular, leading through to a whole movement through to the 1980s and 1990s. And so it sought to be research-based, kind of trying to almost measure and look at the factors, the common factors when churches grow while other churches don't grow. And various lists emerged as reasons for why some churches could be seen to be growing while others didn't. Some common factors on many of these lists, and here's 5 of the key factors that were identified. So first of all, a church has to be intentional about growth. It doesn't tend to grow if it doesn't have growth as part of its core purpose. Secondly, the churches that grow tend to have strong leadership that keep a focus on growth. So it doesn't mean strong in the sense of making all the decisions, doing everything. It means strong in the sense of guiding the church to keep focused on this question of church growth. Thirdly, that the laity are active in this. So people who are not ordained ministers, but are sort of the everyday people of church, they are still very much active, not passive, but actively involved in the church's mission. Fourthly, that there are small groups where relationships are deepened. So even if it's a big church, there are still a focus on having small groups where conversation goes deeper to resource individuals in their own lives. And what also emerged was a striking but somewhat controversial idea known as the homogeneity principle. That is, that churches tend to grow if people in them are similar, a sort of sameness, a cultural sameness. Homogeneous means the sameness of sort of people being of one sort of person, whatever that might mean in a different context. As I say, that was controversial, but it seemed to be the case. Perhaps not that surprising in a sense that people are attracted to people like them. But strikingly, as the church growth movement developed and continued to do its own research, it also found that a little bit later on in the 1990s and forwards, multicultural congregations also have a particular capacity for growth. So actually diversity defied this earlier homogeneity principle, and that diversity in itself became attractive. people liked being in churches where people were different from them as well. There was something exciting and vibrant about it. This shows us that even within those early common factors, there was sort of not a complete consensus, but certainly some ideas that some things tended to be the case in churches that were growing. But some people in the church growth movement still thought it was worth asking questions about this. Should an absolute focus on church growth be intrinsic to the very mission of the church, or is something lost when you put such a focus on growth as a goal in itself? So Bob Jackson, for instance, an Anglican from England, reflected on these sort of issues and recognised that there are four key arguments why a church perhaps shouldn't have church growth as its key goal. First of all, he said, well, the goal of mission is the kingdom of God, not the church. So by putting the focus on church growth, are you sort of missing something that is more important? The pursuit of God's kingdom, which is something external to or more than the life of the church. Secondly, there's an observation that, well, actually, if you're so obsessed with quantity, do you miss out on the question of quality? Is the quality of a community more important than the numbers of people? Quite a persuasive argument, perhaps. Thirdly, that smallness can have a real beauty about it, rather than focusing so much on growth for growth's sake. Because in a smaller church, relationships can sometimes go deeper, be more intimate. It can be a more sort of genuine community, whereas in big churches, people become anonymous, people get lost, people don't have quite such a sense of place and belonging. So the smallness of community can have a power in itself rather than worrying so much about growing and growing. And then fourthly, this argument that the church exists for others, not for its own well-being, its own status, its own success, it also has a sort of power to it. The church shouldn't be so focused on its own numbers that it loses sense of its purpose, which is to serve the needs of people outside of itself. So those are arguments why a church might not be so focused on itself and on its own growth. But on the other hand, Bob Jackson suggested perhaps there are arguments why it should have growth as a focus. So he said, well, growth is a sign of a healthy church, just as in an organism. Nature growth shows that something healthy is happening, that an organism or a community is getting things right if it continues to grow. Secondly, that growth is an indicator of people being reconciled to God, but what he means there specifically is conversion growth. So it's not growth of people transferring from one kind of church to another, or people simply being born into the church, but people being converted to faith, and therefore being, if the church grows because that is happening, it shows that people are being reconciled to God, which for many people in this movement is a key aspect of mission, for people to be reconciled to God. Thirdly, there's the argument, well, rather than sort of romanticizing smallness, the fact is that bigger churches can have a bigger impact on the world around them. Therefore, sort of to Christianize and to make a culture more like God's kingdom. Bigger churches can do that more easily, more effectively than smaller churches can. And bigger churches, fourthly, are taken more seriously. They're noticed more by the world around them. They have more sort of impact in that way. So in these ways, church growth does have value. But what are your own thoughts? It's worth evaluating the movement in your own terms. What do you think about the importance of growth as a focus, or growth not as such a focus? There's another movement called the Natural Church Development Movement, for instance, which is related to church growth movement, but it nudges the focus a little bit towards healthiness rather than growth. Still related, but say a little bit of a nudge, saying what should be the focus for the mission of the church is to be as healthy as possible. And growth might well flow from that, but there's a shift in focus, trying to be a healthy church rather than trying to be a growing church. But other movements that have emerged are a little bit more skeptical about such an absolute focus on growth, that by focusing so much on it, it obscures something about the nature of the gospel. So now just a few moments about this alternative movement called the emerging church. And this particularly arose in the United States, but also in Australia and the UK as well. But in the US, it was particularly a reaction to the sort of mega church movement. So in many ways, a reaction against church growthism, if you like. Um, and this sort of particularly began in the 1990s. Youth workers were beginning to get a bit frustrated with this absolute focus on growth and size and scale and grandeur, um, because they're becoming a bit wary and frustrated with the slickness and packaging, almost as though these big churches were more like businesses, sort of presenting themselves and advertising themselves as successful. And something authentic was being lost. There wasn't a realness about these communities. They were so focused on their own success that they didn't notice something about the gospel, which is about being real. And so the sort of slickness, the shininess, the successfulness of bigness was out of step with the messiness of people's lives and the messiness of faith. That faith often consists of struggle and wrestling and asking questions. And somehow in these big mega churches, that wasn't allowed for. People weren't allowed to be messy and real. They were expected to be part of this shiny package. So there's also in this emerging church movement a very strong sense of the postmodern culture, the willingness to draw on the arts, to ask questions, to reflect on life in more real ways, to be more authentic rather than to sort of present everything as sorted. So here's some key features of the emerging church as it arose, especially as I say in the 1990s and onwards in the UK, the US, Australia, and other places. So first of all, that such churches focused on the life of Jesus rather more than on his death and resurrection. Doesn't mean they weren't interested in his death and resurrection, but the life and ministry of Jesus had somehow been lost in this focus on slickness and an easy sort of packageable theology. If you look to his life, he's hanging out with people who are a bit more messy and complex than that. So instead, you seek to transform rather than flee from the secular realm. You don't try to sort of separate out one part of life from another. You try to be in amongst the mess and the muddle and the complexity and seek to transform it from within. Thirdly, there's a much stronger focus on living communally rather than building successful churches. It's got what does it look like to live communally with each other, to struggle along with each other's struggles. Big emphasis as well on welcoming the stranger, so that people are in church who may not be strictly Christian as people anticipate they should be, in inverted commas. A stronger sense of it being a space for anyone and less judgment about whether someone is inside, has all the right things in their head. Less angst about who's in and who's out, and living with the boundaries being a bit fuzzier, the strangeness of things, the awkwardness of things being a bit more. Serving people with generosity rather than trying to control them to get them to be people who think the same as you. Generosity itself becomes a focus, hospitality, realness, being in amongst people. Also, in the way worship is done, number 6 here is about participating as producers rather than consumers. So people aren't passively receiving the slick presentation from the front, but now become people who offer their own contributions to worship through art, through creativity, through hearing stories and so on. So our own creativity as creative beings becomes something that is part of the story of community building. So leadership is done more collaboratively. It's not about people at the front having the answers and just presenting them in nice, slick ways, but everyone working out ways to live more mutually and communally with one another. Spiritual activities and ritual become a key part of the process rather than sort of it all being about words and all being about answers. Now it becomes about creating space, doing things together which have spiritual meaning, which draws on both ancient traditions and innovates new ways of creating rituals and living with each other spiritually as well. So in all of these things, there's a sort of movement called the emerging church movement, which isn't quite tightly defined because that's not its purpose. It's about being real, reflecting on the struggles of faith, the struggles of life. But as a movement, it didn't quite last. It's now found in many disparate places in different sorts of ways, and perhaps many of the people became what you might call post-evangelical, moving on to a different way of understanding their own faith. But it still had quite an impact on a whole range of people as a reaction against that sort of absolute focus on growthism and size. In both of these movements, we see a turn to the local church. It reminds the church that mission should go to the heart of who we are. It reinstills in us a sense that it's therefore our own responsibility. Mission is something that we do within our own fellowships and communities. It's not something we hand over to specialists. But still note, there are very different ways that people take this on board. Some focus on the necessity for growth in itself. Some focus on the necessity for authenticity rather than growth. We'll look further at these sorts of things and other responses at the local church level when we meet together.